Tonight on Ukraine Today, a cold genocide. In the middle of winter, Russia has left hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians without heating and electricity. A critical situation in Kyiv. Just retribution. Ukrainian soldiers have captured a Russian serviceman involved in the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war in the Kursk region. Ukraine on the offensive. How, according to General Syrskyi, Ukraine's defense forces plan to achieve victory. NATO on the brink. How US territorial ambitions are shaking the North Atlantic alliance. All this and more, right now. Hello, I'm Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and let's move to the news. What's happened in Ukraine overnight can only be described as a night of terror. While much of the Western world was sleeping peacefully, Russia attacked with hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. Here are the consequences. In Kyiv, thousands of homes were left without heating. Almost the entire left bank part of the capital is without water. There are also power outages. In the Rivne region, more than 10,000 people are without electricity. The reason? The enemy strike that damaged critical infrastructure. In the Chernihiv region, occupiers hit energy and communications facilities. The power situation in the north of the region is extremely difficult. Constant Russian attacks are making it harder for repair crews to do their job. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, an infrastructure facility was damaged along with a multi-story residential building and vehicles. In Dnipro, a large boiler house was taken offline, leaving hundreds of buildings without heating. In the Odessa region, Russians damaged an energy infrastructure facility. There was also direct hit by an enemy drone on a multi-story residential building. In the Vinnytsia region, there was a strike on a critical infrastructure site. Just hours before this massive attack, Russian forces struck Kharkiv with guided aerial bombs. A 69-year-old woman was killed. At least 10 people were injured. The bombs damaged dozens of private homes. Ukraine's defense forces struck a drone storage facility in the temporarily occupied part of the Luhansk region. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Explosions were also recorded at the Tuapse oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar region, as well as at an oil depot in the Belgorod region. Earlier, Ukrainian forces struck Kapustin Yar, the Russian test range from which the enemy launches the Oreshnik missile. Details next.
Putin's stronghold is under drone attack. Kapustin Yar is an ordinary settlement where people still live. It is here at the military testing ground that Russia launches ballistic and cruise missiles intended to strike targets hundreds of kilometers away. And all of this happens literally right next to where people live.
This is a place where various types of weapons are tested. And in this case, we're talking about the fact that there are simply launchers or test stands there that would allow for the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. I will always refer to Oreshnik as a scaled-down intercontinental ballistic missile, because we're not talking about any kind of medium-range ballistic missile here.
Including specifically from that very place. On January 9th, Russia launched Oreshnik at the Lviv region. But soon after, strikes also targeted the very testing ground from which the bunker dweller's deadly weapon is launched.
Kapustin Yar was attacked by drones. The central testing ground from where Oreshnik is launched came under attack. Russia was unable to protect this strategic facility.
Moreover, this isn't even the first attack on the testing ground. Drones struck it even in the summer of last year.
There is already evidence confirming that strikes on Kapustin Yar have been carried out and were carried out with the aim to destroy the launchers that could be used to carry out strikes on Ukrainian territory. Therefore, in principle, there are quite a few unremarkable things there that can be destroyed, thereby reducing Russia's potential to use this type of weaponry. Another very important aspect of the strikes on Kapustin Yar is the opportunity to strike at test samples or at a warehouse of partially finished products.
But what's interesting is that missiles intended for Ukraine are increasingly landing in Russia, and not always gently. This even applies to Putin's very own Oreshnik, with which he so fiercely tries to intimidate the world.
Oreshnik. On February 6th, Russia allegedly launched a second missile of the same type, which was aimed at Kyiv. Sirens sounded in the city, but no strikes followed. The missile did not travel far and exploded on Russian territory.
And it's not just about the Oreshnik. There's another missile that the bunker dwellers use to threaten the whole world. Sarmat. But it hasn't even been launched yet. Well, actually, it was launched twice, but both times it crashed in Russia itself. So what's the secret behind such successes of the Russian Federation?
What, it crashed? Yes, it crashed. The result of those crashes, explosions during launches and failed launches is due to the fact that Russia has lost the ability to access quality technical capabilities or has lost the technical base that is located in Ukraine. Of course, they do have engineers, they are working, they are trying to create something.
What is supposed to be a weapon against Ukraine sometimes turns into a threat to the Russians themselves. And the strikes by Ukrainian drones on key Russian military infrastructure only amplify this effect.
Ukrainian soldiers have captured a Russian serviceman involved in the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war in the Kursk region in October 2024. This was said by President Volodymyr Zelensky following a report from the first deputy head of the Security Service of Ukraine, Alexander Poklad. The occupier will now face trial. Ukraine and Russia have agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but only in the area of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is necessary to carry out urgent repair work at the site. At the same time, the enemy continues to apply pressure on the Pokrovsk direction. More details from the battlefield in the report.
Around 50 combat clashes in a single day, that's the level of intensity of the enemy's offensive in the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad agglomeration, as reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi. Despite the enemy's persistence, Syrskyi highlights the professionalism, resilience, and dedication of Ukrainian soldiers, who are thwarting Russian plans to break through the western defenses of Donetsk region.
The attacks near Rodinsky are aimed at taking direct control of the locations held by Ukraine's defense forces, and the attacks near Kryshina are already targeting Pokrovsk itself. It's a similar situation, attempts to take direct control of the locations held by Ukraine's defense forces.
The defense forces operators are always happy to warm up the enemy during this cold winter. The Ukrainian armed forces assure no one will escape their fiery welcome. Ukrainian defenders are destroying the enemy both on the approaches to the city and directly in Pokrovsk itself.
The occupiers are trying to stretch the efforts of Ukraine's defense forces by expanding the theater of operations at the moment when operational reserves are being deployed. In addition, the occupiers are using the tactic of assaults with mechanized columns.
In this video, a Ukrainian kamikaze drone flies into a group of Russian assault troops who had stopped to rest near Pokrovsk. Another recent target of the enemy has become Vovchansk. After suffering defeat near Kupiansk, the occupiers decided to change the direction of their breakthrough.
The defense forces of Ukraine are carrying out successful actions to prevent the capture of this settlement and accordingly the commanding heights. In addition, the occupiers were forced to confirm the presence of Ukraine's defense forces in Vovchansk itself. In other words, all statements about taking full control of the entire settlement, as claimed by the Russian dictator, do not correspond to reality.
The Russians are also showing interest toward Hulyai-Pol in the Zaporizhzhia region.
This is the so-called tactic of 1,000 cuts. That is, they are trying to attack simultaneously along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front. Let me remind you, its length is about 1,200 kilometers. The main goal of this tactic is to divert the operational reserves of the General Staff of Ukraine's defense forces from the main direction of the Russian offensive, which is the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka fronts. In addition, the occupiers are trying through such actions to create the illusion of a breakthrough in secondary sectors of the Russian-Ukrainian front.
Russia and Ukraine, with the mediation of the IAEA, have agreed to a local ceasefire in the area of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in order to begin repairs on the last remaining backup power line. How long the ceasefire will last is unknown, given the level of trust the Russian side has established for itself.
Over the past 24 hours, Russia lost at least 1,130 occupiers killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, total Russian losses have reached 1,228,570. In addition, during the last day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 6 Russian tanks, 6 armored combat vehicles, 60 artillery systems and dozens of other pieces of enemy military equipment. Putin has no intention of ending the war against Ukraine. This assessment was voiced by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi. He emphasized that Ukraine forces will go offensive because victory cannot be achieved through defense alone. All the details next.
While the civilized world hopes for negotiations, the armed forces of Ukraine harbor no illusions and are preparing for a new phase of the war. Ukraine intends not only to hold the line but also to regain the initiative on the battlefield. We
see the enemy's actions, but we don't see any signs. We see the enemy's actions, and we don't see any indications that they are preparing toward any kind of peace negotiations, initiatives, or actions on the battlefield. On the contrary, we see an increase in the intensity of combat operations and a buildup of the enemy's offensive groups. A significant increase and a broad expansion in the overall production volumes of offensive strike weapon systems, missiles, and unmanned drones. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi, explicitly stated during a comprehensive interview with the news outlet LBUA, Pabi Kastirochaka, it is absolutely impossible to win this defensive war by relying on defense alone. That is why the General Staff is already laying out the strategy for a new offensive operation. According to Syrskyi, Russia's strategic goal remains unchanged: the occupation of all of Ukraine. Only the timelines, available resources, and the amount of weaponry at the Kremlin's disposal at each stage of the war change. And under these conditions, passive defense only plays into the enemy's hands. We will conduct an offensive operation. We will strategically execute and implement offensive operations, continuously striving and fighting to preserve our operational initiative, because this inevitably compels and necessitates the enemy to commit and withdraw significant personnel and military human resources, weapons, and ammunition, just to contain our active operations.
The logic of the General Staff is simple. Offensive actions do not necessarily mean a large-scale advance, but they do deprive the enemy of freedom of maneuver, force them to redeploy reserves, and weaken them in other sectors of the front. This is exactly how Ukraine plans to wear down the Russian army, imposing its own tempo of war.
Achieving a definitive Ukrainian victory means that Ukraine has successfully obstructed and neutralized the strategic plans of Moscow. Those specific Russian plans that explicitly envisioned the total and complete elimination of Ukrainian statehood and the full-scale occupation of its entire sovereign territory. So, Russia's inability to achieve such a victory, which was in fact declared by Putin and is supported by a significant part of Russian society, that in my view is what constitutes a Ukrainian victory.
In 2026, Oreffi's approach does not change either. Russia still bets on victory, not on efficiency but on sheer numbers. According to Syrskyi, the mobilization potential of the aggressor country exceeds 20 million people, of whom 4.5 million are already a trained reserve. This year, Moscow plans to call up more than 409,000 people, while simultaneously forming new divisions and replenishing losses, which have already exceeded 850,000 over the past 2 years of war.
At least 11 divisions. No less than 11 divisions for this year. And of course, the continuation of carrying out plans and tasks that were not completed last year.
However, even with this approach, the aggressor faces serious limitations. According to the Ukrainian command, despite large-scale mobilization, the number of enemy assault groups at the front remains almost unchanged. It's all because of the colossal losses, which deplete resources faster than they can be replenished. This is exactly what derailed Moscow's plans to form fully-fledged reserve armies and forced them to throw fresh troops into patching up already existing sections of the front.
Part of the strategic reserve. Do you remember that he planned to form 14 divisions? He managed to form no more than half, and even then only partially, and those resources were used to make up for losses.
But the Kremlin's main bet is not just on numbers. They are focusing on strike drones and plan to reach the use of up to 1,000 drones per day. This means a change in the very logic of the war. Even deeper strikes, constant pressure on the rear, and new challenges for Ukrainian air defense and the front as a whole. At the same time, Syrskyi emphasizes that 2025 has not become a year of defeats for Ukraine. Russia has not managed to achieve any of its strategic objectives, neither a breakthrough deep into Ukraine, nor the encirclement of key cities, nor a breach of the defenses.
The enemy was unable to accomplish any of its plans. Do you remember how many such bold claims there were? The enemy was unable to accomplish any of its plans. Do you remember how many loud statements there were about them finishing this special operation? Before the summer, or for example, before the new year? There were a lot of such statements. I remember there were 6 or 7 just for individual directions. They planned offensives, they had very ambitious plans to capture our country, but none of those plans were realized.
To capture our nation. But an even more difficult stage lies ahead. The war is increasingly turning into a competition of economies and technologies, where drones, artificial intelligence, hypersonic strikes, and a state's ability to scale up weapons production faster than the enemy play a decisive role. That is precisely why, as the commander-in-chief emphasizes, you don't negotiate with the weak. The conditions for peace are created only by strength.
Both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. This means producing enough missile weaponry. This applies to both ballistic and cruise missiles. And the use of the latest types of weapons, such as laser weapons, and moving to a new level of equipping the armed forces, which will allow us to reduce the direct involvement of people in combat operations and increase the participation of machines. First and foremost, this means drone systems. And of course, the further development of artificial intelligence.
First and foremost, it's about drone systems, and of course, the further development of artificial intelligence. Essentially, Ukraine is betting on the war of the future, where the decisive factor is not the size of the army but technology, the economy, and the ability to adapt more quickly. According to Syrskyi, this is precisely where Ukraine has real grounds to hope for a turning point in the war.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Now's the time to subscribe, like this video and share it, so more people can see it. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. The North Atlantic Alliance is on the brink of collapse. Let's be clear. What is happening around Greenland in the context of President Trump's increasingly open desire to seize control of the territory could realistically lead to a US exit from NATO and potentially to the end of the alliance as we know it. Europe refuses to support Washington's territorial ambitions. In response, Trump is acting aggressively and appears to be deliberately escalating the situation. In Washington, a narrative is being constructed in which decisions about Greenland are made by the United States, not by Denmark, to which Greenland legally belongs. Frankly, this looks very far from healthy diplomacy, and it raises a flood of questions, from the emotional "what the hell is going on?" to the very concrete "why is Trump doing this?" Strategic interests? Fine. But why not negotiate with Copenhagen? Why issue ultimatums? This could still be a complex foreign policy game by the American president and his team. Or it could be something closer to a great power political psychosis. The Kremlin has already begun saying that Crimea is no less important to Russia's security than Greenland is to the United States. Let me guess. Soon we may hear something similar from Beijing about Taiwan. The result is troubling. Instead of clearly showing Russia and China that such behavior is unacceptable, the United States appears to be mirroring the logic of the Kremlin, potentially triggering a chain reaction with enormous destructive consequences. That is why the likelihood of creating a new military alliance without the United States but with Ukraine is now quite high.
The political crisis surrounding the island of Greenland has made the EU reconsider how to move forward without America's support. Donald Trump made it clear to the whole world that he is determined to take the island at any cost.
If we don't go in there, Russia and China will. Denmark won't be able to do anything about it, but we can do everything.
The threat by the US president to impose tariffs on any country that tries to prevent him from seizing Greenland was the last straw for the EU's patience. This was reported by the American publication Politico.
But for many European governments, including America's oldest and most loyal allies, Trump's threat to impose punitive tariffs on anyone who tries to stop him from seizing Greenland was the last straw. They believe that now a breakup is inevitable. Infrequent conversations, concerned European officials called Trump's hasty decision to annex sovereign Danish territory madness and delirium. Politico.
It seems that Europe is ready to create a new alliance instead of NATO, without the US but with Ukraine. Ukraine could play a crucial role in this defense alliance due to the size of its territory, its geographic location, its defense industry, and the fact that it is already at war and has invaluable experience.
Ukraine will be key to Europe's defense, primarily because of its technological base, particularly its well-established production of top-class drones and the presence of the largest army in Europe. Juraj Majchin, military analyst.
For example, the United Kingdom, France, the Scandinavian and Baltic countries, Poland, Germany and Italy spent most of Trump's second term working as part of an effective group without America, the so-called Coalition of the Willing. And it could become the beginning of a defense alliance between Ukraine and Europe.
The Coalition of the Willing initially dealt with issues concerning Ukraine. It created very close ties between some key people in the capitals. They strengthened trust and the ability to cooperate. They know each other by name. It's easy for them to get in touch and send a message. If we include the military might of Ukraine, as well as the might of France, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, the potential armed force of a coalition of the willing would be enormous. It would include both nuclear and non-nuclear states. Politico.
Europe currently buys all of Ukraine's weapons from the United States, and Ukraine, in turn, has the largest combat-ready army in Europe. Therefore, a new military alliance without the United States is quite possible, considering that the threat from Russia will not disappear even after a possible peace agreement.
Ukraine has friends who understand the nature of Russian aggression as a shared problem. With them, we can try to create defensive alliances. On a tactical level, we can try to form regional alliances, for example, with the Baltic countries, Poland, other Central European states, and the United Kingdom. This would be a temporary and not very stable means of pursuing our strategic interests, but it is both possible and necessary to look for other options for defense alliances. Anatoly Kruglashov, political scientist.
The question of the EU's need for defense without US support has been discussed for a long time. In recent days, there have been numerous initiatives and bold headlines coming out of Brussels. And a coalition of the willing with Ukraine could be the beginning of the creation of a new defensive alliance. Officially, the EU has decided to ensure its self-defense by 2030, but under wartime conditions, this decision could be made much sooner.
And finally, money and foreign policy. The 56th World Economic Forum is opening in Davos, Switzerland. Political leaders and business elites will discuss major global challenges. It is expected that President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet there with the US President Donald Trump. All the details next.
The 56th World Economic Forum has begun in Davos, Switzerland. According to analysts' forecasts, the main goal will be to figure out how to deal with the world order that has been shaken over the past year by US President Trump.
This will be a record-breaking forum in terms of overall representation from all sides, and so to speak, from the G7 Europeans, and in fact all the key players in the world. It will be necessary to figure out how to go on living in a world without rules, and with such, to put it mildly, aggressive policies from the United States of America.
It was planned that during the forum, the Europeans would put pressure on Trump to personally support security guarantees for Ukraine, as well as to sign an agreement on reconstruction worth $800 billion.
The investment agreement, which was also formally called the Prosperity Agreement, for a total sum of $800 billion with the United States of America. But right now, the prospects for such a joint meeting between Europeans, Americans, and Ukraine, and for discussing security guarantees, which, by the way, Jay Semiraya wanted to hold specifically in Davos, look rather contradictory and somewhat unclear.
But just a few days before the forum, the American president upended all the plans and once again stated that Ukraine is less ready to reach a peace agreement than Russia.
Russia wants Ukraine to succeed one day. That sounds strange. I explained this to President Zelensky, but President Putin is very generous towards Ukraine, including his willingness to supply energy resources and other goods at very low prices.
I think Trump expects a lot of applause, a lot of flattery, a lot of grandeur from this Davos. Essentially, it includes absolutely every single thing that he truly loves.
In addition, Trump announced new tariffs for European countries that do not support him on the issue of Greenland. And this, of course, will negatively affect the further negotiation process involving the Europeans.
Raising tariffs for countries that have decided to contribute to Greenland's security is, in my opinion, a mistake, and I do not agree with it. The intentions of some countries to send troops to strengthen security should not be seen as an initiative against the United States. I believe we should resume dialogue and avoid escalation.
According to experts, the main thing the American president is bringing to Davos is his new idea of a peace council, which is supposed to sideline the UN and to which, inconveniently, Trump plans to invite Russia.
This council will be unlike any other. It will include the leaders of the world's largest countries, and it was a great honor for me to be chosen as the chairman of this Peace Council. I think you will see something that no one has ever seen before. Nowhere else will there be a gathering of participants like the one we are about to announce. Everyone wants to join us.
There's already talk about a peace council which Trump might announce in Davos for Ukraine. This is where participation by the Russian Federation is also being proposed. In my opinion, this is an important point that our delegation should have proactively removed from the agenda because, of course, such statements will certainly not strengthen the relationship between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States of America.
Be that as it may, experts are not predicting any serious upheavals. All the more so since the theme of this year's forum is dialogue.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. See you next time.